Hello, my name is Caroline Stromberg and I am a paleontologist. I am a professor in biology at the University of Washington in Seattle and also a curator of paleobotany at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture. And paleobotany, which is what I study, is a kind of a paleontology. So paleontology, as you probably know, is the study of fossil, so the study of extinct animals and plants. Um, and sorry, I'm just going to turn this off here. Okay, sorry. And what I study is botany, so extinct plants. Okay, so I've been asked to answer some of your questions about fossils and some of the very common questions that I get asked by kids and other people, anyone that's curious. And the first question is, what is a fossil? You probably have some ideas, but I'm going to tell you the answer. So a fossil is any remains of past life. So any organism that lived, it leaves a trace, or it leaves a part of itself, and it becomes a fossil. So we have two major types of fossils. One is called a body fossil, and that's when a part of an organism is preserved as a fossil over many millions of years or thousands of years. And so, for example, a leaf or a bone or a tooth or something like that, that's a body fossil. And then we also have trace fossils, and trace fossils are when an organism does something, walks around or something like that, and there's a trace of it in the fossil record. So for example, if a dinosaur walks across a sandy beach and that beach is preserved with the footprints that the dinosaur left, that's a trace fossil. Or if we have a fossil leaf where you can see that an insect has taken some bites, it has eaten off the edge of the leaf. That trace of the eating by the insect, that's a trace fossil. Or my favorite kind of trace fossil is fossilized poop. And we call that a coprolite. And that's super cool and interesting because you can find out about what an animal ate if you can study what's inside that fossilized poop. Okay, so that's what a fossil is. Another question that I often get asked is, what things can you do with fossils? What can you learn from fossils? And you can learn a whole lot from fossils. One thing is that we can look at the fossil, the body or the part of a body of an organism, and we can try to figure out what it is or what it was most closely related to. And by doing that, we can learn something about how different organisms have evolved on Earth. As maybe you know, or maybe not, life evolved once on Earth, and all organisms that you see around you, all the plants and animals and microorganisms like bacteria and things like that, they all came from the same one origin of life. So a lot has happened to get this diversity of life that we see around us today. And so by looking at fossils, we can learn how that happened over millions and billions of years. Another thing we can do is we can look at what the landscape looked like a long time ago. So we can look at plants in the past and look at what the vegetation was like. Was it a forest? Was it a desert? Was it a swamp or something like that? And that can allow us to figure out in what environments, in what sort of landscape that dinosaurs lived or other animals lived. And we can also learn how those ecosystems, how those landscapes have changed over time, and perhaps learn how they have changed as climate has changed on Earth, because climate has changed a lot on Earth, from hot to cold, to hot again, and to cold, and so on. And so, for example, large parts of Earth have been covered in ice several times during even just the last 500 million years. Okay, another thing we can learn by, for example, looking at these fossilized poops or leaves with insect bites is how animals and plants or different animals have interacted. So sometimes we find there, for example, there was a very cool fossil of a snake that was curled around some dinosaur eggs from India that a friend of mine found and described. And so that showed that that snake ate dinosaur eggs. That was a part of its diet. Or if we look at a leaf, like I said, if there are insect bites, we can learn that certain insect ate those leaves. Or if we look at a coprolite, we can learn what that animal that made the poop ate. And if we look at other kinds of traces like footprints or traces of animals moving on the seafloor, we can learn about how those animals moved. Okay, what other questions do people have? Okay, one very common question is, how do you find fossils? And it would be easy enough to say that you just go out and you start digging, but that's not how it typically happens. More commonly, so we find fossils in something called sedimentary rock. So that's basically sand and like you see on the beach, and or clay, like you jump in a muddy puddle or something, or yeah, something in between. And when those become rocks, it's in those kinds of rocks that we most typically find fossils. So what most commonly happens is that people walk around in nature and they see something. Then maybe they see a bone or a tooth or a branch, a fossil branch of a tree, and they pick it up and they tell a paleontologist about it. And then that paleontologist can go out and look for fossils in that area from those rocks where you know, anyone can find the fossils. Sometimes farmers, when they plow their fields, they find fossils because there's maybe fossils in the rock beneath the field, and that way they can then go and dig for fossils. So it's sort of serendipitous. But once you know in what kinds of rocks fossils are, you can look for those rocks on the landscape and try to find where those rocks are exposed. So where you see the rock and it's not covered in grass or something, and you can go and sort of follow that rock and try to see if you can find fossils. And what we use to really dig into the rock are rock hammers and shovels, depending on how soft the rock is, or even pickaxes, or even sometimes drills. Yeah, so there are a lot of tools to get into the rock once you know where to look. Another question that I often get is, how do fossils form? And the most important thing to form a fossil is to cover it in sediment. So maybe an organism or a leaf falls into a lake and falls to the bottom, and then it's covered by sand or silt or clay or mud. And that way, when it's covered, there's no fish or something that comes and eats it, or it doesn't break down and rot and so on, and so that it disappears. It stays there covered, and so then it gets more and more covered. There's more and more layers of sediment building up on top, and eventually there'll be so much stuff on top that there's a lot of pressure, and then it starts turning into more rock-like. And the sediment that it's covered in turns into a rock, so it's hard. Yeah, that's more or less how fossils are made. Okay, what are different kinds of fossils? I'm sure you have some good ideas. Maybe the most common things that you think of are shells, like seashells, like I'm blanking, but like mussels or oysters or other things like that. There's of course also bones, like dinosaur bones or mammoth bones or something like that, and teeth. Most of the fossils that we find of mammals, our own kind, is teeth, also bones, but the teeth preserve really well. And then of course the fossils that I study, the plant fossils, there are leaves that can be preserved. Like I said, they often fall into a lake and then they're covered, and so you can get preservation of leaves that you can see all the details, all the veins and things in them. You also can get fossilized wood, so big trunks, you know, like a tree has a big trunk, and those trunks can be sort of, they're in the ground, and water with a lot of minerals in them come into the cells of the wood and form little bits of opal inside the wood. So it basically becomes like, it becomes encrusted and filled with this opal or this silica, and then it becomes premineralized or petrified. So you probably heard of petrified wood. That's the kind of fossil that becomes. And then what else do we have? Oh, another cool kind of fossil is when you have a fossil that becomes buried, and then in say clay or something like that, or mud, and then the fossil itself rots away and it leaves a hole in this mud, and then that hole is filled with maybe sand or another type of clay, or a mineral or something. And then when this mud is weathering away and exposing what's inside, you have basically a cast. So it's like a replica of the original organism trapped inside the sediment. And when you pick it out, it looks just like the organism. So maybe like a stump or what other things? Yeah, and even the whole shape of an animal sometimes. The blue lake rhino is something that we have here in Washington, which was basically a hole made by a rhino that rotted away. Yeah, so that's another cool kind of fossil, a cast. Ooh, there's some fossils that you probably have heard of. Those are like maybe insects or plants that are preserved in amber. So amber, that's when certain trees make resin, and that resin, maybe an animal or an insect or something gets stuck in that, and then they are preserved inside, and it's transparent, and then when it becomes a rock, it becomes amber. And so for example, the mosquito in Jurassic Park was, the movie, the Jurassic Park, was preserved in amber. And those are really cool because you can see all the little details inside. And then there's another cool fossil, and that is kind of fossil, and that's when things become frozen. So there's mammoths and babies of mammoths even that are preserved frozen in the soil in Russia, for example. And so then even the flesh and the fur and everything is preserved. So it's really amazing. You can see a lot of detail on those fossils. And then sometimes we can find mummified fossils in caves, for example, where it's so dry that they just preserved as a dried, shriveled up version of themselves. I think those are the main kinds of fossils that I can think of now. There's of course also the trace fossils that I mentioned. So footprints that are preserved in rock, or the fossilized poop, the coprolites. Yeah, there are other kinds of fossils too, but those are the main kinds. I think those were the main questions that most people tend to ask. I can tell you what I study. I am particularly interested in something that you probably don't think of as interesting: grasses. But you see them all around you. They're everywhere in the African savanna, or in a meadow in the Cascade Mountains, or a golf course, or a lot of what you eat is grass. So popcorn or rice or bread made from wheat and so on. And I'm studying how grasses evolved and when we see grasslands on Earth. And it's only in the last 30 million years or so. That probably sounds like a long time, but it's not very long if you compare to how long we've had life on this planet. Okay, I hope you enjoy your camp. Paleontology is awesome. And if you get a chance, when the Burke reopens, if you are nearby here, you should come and visit. We have some really cool fossils to show you on display. So Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your camp.